The evening had been ordinary, the kind of summer night when the air was warm enough to roll down the windows and let the breeze in. The couple had left their small rental home just outside of town, telling friends they were going for a drive before sunset, maybe to grab a late dinner at one of the diners that lined the old Scenic highway. They had been together for nearly 3 years, talking openly about marriage and children, and by all accounts they seemed happy, playful, grounded, without the kind of tension people sometimes notice only in hindsight. Friends recalled how he carried her purse absent-mindedly when she went to the restroom, or how she teased him for singing off-key to the radio. It was the picture of young love, uncomplicated and hopeful. The last time anyone saw them was around 6:30 p.m. At a gas station near the base of the mountains, security cameras later confirmed the sighting. She bought bottled water. He topped off the tank. Nothing unusual, no signs of stress or unease. They exchanged a smile, kissed before getting back into the car, and then pulled away toward the narrow highway that curled along the reservoir. The sun was dropping lower by then, painting the horizon in fading orange. The drive was meant to be a casual outing, a way to unwind after work, nothing more. But from that moment, the couple seemed to slip out of the world entirely. When they didn't come home that night, their families weren't immediately alarmed. They were young, spontaneous, the type to take a detour and get caught up exploring some overlook or back road. Calls went unanswered, but in the first few hours, no one panicked. By morning, that changed. Parents and siblings began leaving voicemails, their voices rising from curiosity to worry. One mother drove the route herself, scanning roadside pull-offs for their car, but saw nothing. The hours stretched into the evening of the following day, and the reality began to set in. Something was wrong. By the time the couple was reported missing, more than 24 hours had passed since the gas station sighting. Local police treated it seriously from the start. These weren't teenagers running away, nor was there any history of troubled behavior. Both held steady jobs, had family connections, and were known in their community. Officers traced their known route, contacting businesses along the Scenic Drive. A waitress remembered serving a couple that matched their description earlier that night, laughing, ordering burgers and fries, leaving behind a tip in cash. But beyond that, the trail went cold. Their phones showed no activity after 7:12 p.m., when a ping registered from a tower near the northern rim of the reservoir. After that, digital silence. For the families, the sudden void was unbearable. They gathered in each other's living rooms, staring at their own phones, waiting for a call that never came. Neighbors brought food, but the plates went untouched. Friends combed through social media posts for hidden meaning, wondering if they had missed some sign of trouble. But the truth was simpler and crueler. They had vanished in the middle of a normal night without leaving even a thread to pull on. The car was gone, their wallets and IDs untraceable, and with each passing day, the situation grew stranger. Search crews began scouring the region. Patrol cars lined the curves of the Scenic highway, shining spotlights down steep embankments. Helicopters hovered above the reservoir, scanning for debris. Volunteers formed lines in the woods, calling out their names as if the sound might pull them back. But nothing answered. It was as though the couple had stepped off the map entirely, swallowed by the landscape. Reporters soon caught the story. Young couple missing on Scenic Drive splashed across local headlines, bringing cameras to the quiet town. Interviews with friends painted them as inseparable, always holding hands, always talking about plans. The contrast between their bright future and the black hole of their disappearance only deepened the unease. Commentators speculated openly. Could it have been a car accident, a kidnapping, even foul play by someone they knew? But the facts were frustratingly scarce. Police faced the same wall. Without a vehicle, without a crime scene, without witnesses, their options were limited. Still, they poured resources into the early days. Dogs were brought in to track scent along the roadside pull-offs. Dive teams tested the reservoir, though visibility was so poor the effort was nearly futile. They came up empty each time, leaving families to sit through press conferences where investigators admitted the same phrase again and again: no leads. In the quiet spaces between search efforts, grief began to root itself. Bedrooms sat untouched, clothes folded in drawers, text messages unanswered on locked phones that would never light up again. Parents left their porch lights on every night, unwilling to let go of the belief that maybe, just maybe, the couple would walk back through the door. But reality sharpened with every week that passed. Disappearance had hardened into absence, and absence had hardened into mystery. What unsettled everyone most was the clean break. No trace of struggle, no financial trail, no communication. They had simply set out for a drive, smiled at each other in the gas station camera, and then ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident, people whispered. Something had intervened, something unseen. By the end of that first week, families were already asking themselves the question no one wanted to speak aloud. How could two people, a car, and everything they carried just vanish without a trace? The search was only beginning, but the answer, whatever it was, remained hidden in the silence of that scenic drive, leaving behind nothing but questions that would grow heavier with time. The first 48 hours are always the most critical in a missing persons case, and detectives knew that if the couple had run into trouble, time was slipping away quickly. They began retracing every mile of the scenic highway, starting with the last confirmed stop at the gas station. Clerks remembered them clearly, the young woman carrying 2 bottles of water, the man swiping his card for fuel. Security footage showed them smiling, casually chatting, nothing in their manner hinting at distress. From there, investigators moved outward, interviewing waitresses, motel managers, hikers returning from the trailheads, anyone who might have noticed the couple's sedan. Some thought they had seen a similar car, but nothing could be pinned down. Each lead fizzled when pressed for detail, and there were no receipts, no credit card swipes, no calls made after they left the gas station. The couple's cell phones offered the first fragile thread. Records showed that her phone had last pinged at 7:12 p.m., his just a minute later, both hitting the same tower along the northern stretch of highway. After that, silence. The tower's reach extended to a wide swath of terrain, including a remote area where the road curved tightly against the massive reservoir. Investigators highlighted that stretch immediately. Accidents had happened there before, cars sliding off wet pavement, trucks jackknifing in storms. But usually there was wreckage, tire marks, or some witness to the event. Here, there was nothing. Search operations escalated quickly. Patrol units drove the length of the reservoir, peering over guardrails and stopping at overlooks. Teams moved into the woods on either side, walking shoulder to shoulder in grids, calling out the couple's names. Search dogs were deployed, their handlers leading them through roadside pull-offs and trailheads. For hours, the dogs worked without alert, circling aimlessly as if the trail had evaporated. Helicopters flew over the reservoir, crews scanning for any sign of floating debris, a broken guardrail, even a glimmer of metal beneath the water's surface. But the water was deep and dark, clouded by silt that shifted with the slightest current. Even sonar sweeps dragged across the reservoir floor revealed little more than uneven terrain and drowned tree trunks. The lack of evidence unsettled everyone. In most accidents, even the worst ones, something remains. Shards of glass, a scrape along the guardrail, tracks in the gravel. But here, the road seemed pristine, as if no vehicle had ever left it. Investigators questioned whether the couple had even taken the highway at all, or if they had diverted onto a side road. They checked cabins, rest stops, and private campgrounds. No one had seen them. As news spread, more tips flooded in. A trucker claimed he'd seen headlights swerve near mile marker 42, but couldn't be sure of the make or model. A fisherman thought he remembered hearing a loud splash that night, but admitted it could have been rocks tumbling from the cliffs. Each statement was logged, checked, and eventually dismissed as inconclusive. The highway, which had carried thousands of travelers that summer, had swallowed this one couple whole. Detectives began widening the circle, digging into phone records, bank statements, and personal histories. Had they planned to run off together? Were they in debt, hiding from someone? Nothing suggested that. Both were financially stable, with steady jobs and active social lives. Their families described them as reliable, deeply connected to their routines. Theories of voluntary disappearance collapsed quickly under the weight of their ordinary lives. Attention returned again and again to the reservoir. Older locals spoke of its reputation. The water was deceptively calm on the surface, but brutal beneath. Currents ran cold and fast, fed by mountain runoff, and its depth reached nearly 200 feet in places. Cars had gone in before, swallowed whole, never resurfacing. Forensic divers tried multiple times, dropping into the black water with tether lines and high-powered lights. Visibility was measured in inches. Silt clouded around them, swallowing beams of light, making the search feel like groping blind through an abyss. After days of effort, divers surfaced with nothing to show but exhaustion and frustration. Families gathered on the shorelines during these searches, watching from picnic benches and rocky outcroppings. Mothers clutched one another's hands, staring at the water as if it might give up its secret. The silence that followed each failed dive was crushing. Reporters framed their coverage around the haunting image of parents staring into the reservoir, hoping against hope that something, anything, might surface. When the official searches wound down, investigators admitted what the families had already begun to fear. Without new leads, the case was stalling. The couple had vanished without witnesses, without evidence, without the faintest trace of their final moments. Police kept the file open, but privately many officers admitted they had little else to pursue. The Scenic Drive, a place meant to showcase beauty and tranquility, now carried a heavy association of loss and unanswered questions. For the community, the disappearance became a kind of wound. Drivers slowed instinctively when they reached the northern curve of the reservoir, eyes flicking toward the water as though they might glimpse a clue. Families clung to the phone records, the final pings that circled back to that one stretch of road. If the couple had left the highway willingly, someone would have seen them. If they had been taken, there should have been a struggle. If they had crashed, there should have been wreckage. But there was nothing, only the silence of the water holding tight to whatever truth lay beneath its surface. And in that silence, the story of their disappearance deepened into mystery, drawing in not just families and friends, but strangers, each wondering how two young people, full of life and promise, could vanish into the night with no trace left behind. The investigation was far from over, but the more that was searched, the more it seemed as though the answers had been erased before anyone knew to look for them. In the weeks after the couple's disappearance, uncertainty gave way to speculation. With no new evidence surfacing, the silence of the case created a vacuum that was quickly filled with rumor. Theories began spreading in the community and then spilled onto the internet, where strangers picked apart every scrap of information. The lack of answers was unbearable, and people began to invent their own. Some whispered that the couple had staged it, that they wanted to leave behind their lives, to start fresh somewhere far away. Others imagined a darker explanation, that they had been abducted or carjacked along the isolated highway. Still others clung to the idea of an accident, convinced the reservoir had swallowed them. None of these theories were proven, but each carried enough plausibility to take root. Police did their best to tamp down the rumors, but they struggled against the wave of speculation. A diner receipt, time-stamped only 30 minutes before the cell phone pings, became a fixation online. Some sleuths argued that the receipt proved the couple had traveled north faster than expected, meaning they may have stopped elsewhere along the way. Others believed the tip left in cash suggested they had been in a hurry, as though fleeing something. Investigators confirmed the meal in the timeline, but saw nothing suspicious in it. Still, the conversation grew, with people who had never met the couple now theorizing about their motives, their relationship, and their secrets. One witness, a man who lived near the reservoir, claimed he had heard the screech of tires and a sharp metallic sound late that evening. He told police it reminded him of a guardrail being struck. Search teams investigated the stretch of highway near his home, but found no fresh damage, no scrapes, no broken posts, no shards of metal. Yet his account circulated online, reinterpreted in dozens of ways. Some believed it was proof of an accident. Others suggested it was the sound of an abduction, a car being forced off the road. As the theories spread, so too did the pain they caused. Family members found themselves defending their loved ones against strangers who had never known them. Accusations of murder-suicide were especially cruel, painting the couple's love as a facade for hidden darkness. Parents went on local news, pleading with the public not to make assumptions, reminding everyone that their children were kind, hopeful, and in no way planning to end their lives. But words online had a momentum of their own. and the story was too magnetic to stop. Detectives entertained every possibility, however far-fetched, because the truth was they had nothing solid to dismiss them. They reviewed the couple's finances, searching for sudden withdrawals or hidden accounts. There were none. They looked into travel records, but no plane tickets or border crossings were ever booked. Interviews with friends and co-workers yielded no hints of a secret plan to disappear. Yet the theory of voluntary vanishing refused to die, perhaps because it was one of the few explanations that fit the complete lack of evidence. Other theories leaned darker. Some pointed to the possibility of a carjacking on the isolated stretch of road. They imagined strangers lying in wait at pull-offs, armed and opportunistic. The reservoir, with its unfathomable depths, could have concealed both the victims and the crime. But police pointed out there had been no reports of similar crimes in the area. Violent incidents were rare, and there was no sign of another vehicle fleeing the scene. Still, once the idea took hold, it circulated relentlessly. The reservoir itself became almost mythic in the way people talked about it. Locals described it as cursed, claiming that more than one life had been lost to its waters. Divers had recovered cars decades earlier, their skeleton frames covered in algae, but many believed other vehicles still rested unseen at the bottom. For some, this was the most logical theory. The couple had simply missed a curve, gone off the road, and disappeared into the water. The problem was that the reservoir had already been searched multiple times with sonar and divers, and nothing had been found. That contradiction fed the mystery, leaving room for other theories to thrive. As days turned into weeks, the families were left to navigate the storm of speculation. They endured comments online that dissected their children's lives as though they were characters in a mystery novel. Strangers demanded to know whether the couple had been arguing, whether there were secrets in their relationship, whether one had harmed the other. Each theory chipped away at the image of who they were, replacing their real selves with projections of fear, suspicion, and doubt. Families begged for focus to return to the facts. 2 people had disappeared, and there was still no trace of where they had gone. But the truth was harder to hold on to than rumor. Without new evidence, the case became a kind of mirror, reflecting the fears and assumptions of everyone who looked into it. To some, it was a tragic accident. To others, it was a crime. To still others, it was an unsolvable mystery. The kind of story that would linger forever without resolution. For investigators, the challenge was not only in finding the couple, but in cutting through the noise to find what was real. Every rumor had to be weighed, every theory examined, because within the cloud of speculation might still be a sliver of truth. But for now, all that remained was silence, broken by whispers of what might have been. The reservoir became the focus almost as soon as investigators realized how abruptly the couple's trail ended. It stretched for miles beside the highway, a man-made body of water carved into the mountains decades earlier when a river was dammed to generate power. At first glance, it looked calm, almost inviting, a mirror of gray water reflecting the cliffs and the sky. But locals knew better. They told stories of its depth, of how the bottom dropped off suddenly just feet from shore, and of how its currents could drag down anything that slipped beneath the surface. Over the years, there had been accidents, drivers losing control on rain-slick curves, cars found years later when the water dropped low enough to reveal them. And there were others, never found at all, vehicles and lives lost to the silence of the reservoir. Detectives believed this could have been the couple's fate. It was a simple explanation, but one that made a chilling kind of sense. The cell phone pings ended near the northern rim where the road curved tightly against the water. If their car had veered even slightly off course, it could have plunged through the guardrail and into the depths. Yet when investigators scoured that stretch, they found no broken rails, no torn soil, nothing to indicate a crash. It was as if the highway had remained untouched. That absence only deepened the mystery. Search teams moved quickly to test the theory. Dive crews were assembled, men and women trained to operate in zero-visibility conditions. They dropped into the reservoir tethered to lines, heavy lights strapped to their helmets. The water was colder than expected, murkier than they had prepared for. Just a few kicks of their fins stirred up clouds of silt that erased the beams of their flashlights. It felt like swimming in ink, They fanned out methodically, touching the floor with gloved hands, searching by feel for anything metallic or out of place. But the reservoir's bottom was unpredictable. Jagged rock shelves, sudden drop-offs, even entire trees left standing when the valley was flooded decades earlier. After hours of effort, the divers surfaced exhausted, shaking their heads. They had found nothing. Sonar equipment was brought in, dragged slowly across the water's surface in overlapping grids. The images that returned were difficult to interpret, blotches of shadow and light, shapes that might have been car-sized or might have been nothing more than boulders. Technicians studied the screens carefully, marking possible targets. Divers went down again, probing those areas, but still the searches came back empty. Each failed attempt wore down hope, replacing it with dread. Families gathered on the shore as these operations unfolded, standing behind yellow tape, watching the boats and divers. They prayed silently, some clutching photographs of the couple, others just staring at the water with hollow eyes. To them, the reservoir was no longer just a body of water. It was an enemy, holding something it refused to give up. Each time divers rose with nothing to report, the family's grief deepened. They wanted closure, even if it meant confirming the worst. Instead, they were left with silence. Reporters began to frame the reservoir as the villain of the story. They highlighted its history, interviewing locals who recalled other tragedies. One man spoke of his uncle's truck that had gone off the road in the 70s, never recovered. Another recalled a teenager who drowned years earlier, his body never resurfacing. The reservoir, they said, swallowed everything. That reputation made it seem the obvious answer to the couple's disappearance, but without physical proof, it remained only a theory. Weeks turned into months, and still no trace appeared. Search operations dwindled as resources were stretched thin. Police admitted privately that the reservoir could not be fully searched. Its depth, its unpredictable bottom, and its sheer size made the task almost impossible. There were places so deep and unstable that divers could not risk entering. Even sonar could not penetrate certain areas where debris and currents distorted the signals. In those places, anything could be hidden. The silence weighed heavily on investigators. They were trained to follow evidence, but here there was none to follow. The reservoir loomed as both the most logical explanation and the least provable. Each officer who patrolled the highway at night felt it, the unnerving thought that beneath the calm surface, the truth might already be lying in the dark. For the families, the silence was unbearable. They drove to the overlook again and again, staring into the water, searching for signs they knew they would never see. Some threw flowers into the reservoir, watching them drift and sink, symbolic gestures for lives that seemed swallowed whole. Others refused to accept the theory, insisting that if no car had been found, then their children must still be out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered. Hope and despair twisted together in every conversation, each passing day another reminder of what had been lost. By the end of that first summer, the reservoir had taken on a haunting presence. To drive along its curves was to feel a weight pressing down, as if the water itself carried secrets too heavy to release. Investigators closed their reports each night with no progress to note, only the same unanswered question. If the couple had gone into the water, why had the reservoir refused to reveal them? The case was no closer to resolution. The search had reached the limits of what could be done, and the silence of the reservoir only grew louder with time. The weeks bled into months, and the disappearance that had once dominated headlines slowly slipped from daily news cycles into the quiet corners of unsolved case files. For the families, though, time did not move the same way. Every day was marked by absence, by the lack of a phone call, by unopened birthday cards, by 2 empty chairs at the dinner table. Birthdays passed without celebration. Anniversaries came and went with no one to mark them. What had begun as a frantic search for answers hardened into a kind of suspended grief, a waiting that seemed endless. Detectives monitored the couple's financial records, hoping for even the smallest indication of life. There was nothing. No credit card swipes, no withdrawals from bank accounts, no attempts to access email or social media. Their phones remained dark, numbers that went straight to voicemail, inboxes that filled with unanswered messages. In missing persons cases, even fugitives leave traces. But here, there was nothing. It was as though the couple had been erased the night they left the gas station. Families clung to hope at first, convincing themselves that no news meant there was still a chance. Some believed the car would eventually surface in the reservoir, that a drought or another search would reveal it. Others leaned toward the idea of abduction, telling themselves their loved ones were alive somewhere, being held against their will but waiting to be found. Hope took many shapes, but each was fragile, constantly battered by the brutal reality that months were turning into years without a single lead. Police tried to reassure the families, but behind closed doors they admitted the trail was cold. Every potential witness had been interviewed, every tip exhausted. The files thickened with reports, but none brought investigators closer to an answer. Search operations dwindled. What had once been dozens of officers, volunteers, and helicopters became a single detective checking in once a month, waiting for a new lead that never came. The silence weighed heavily on the families. They began organizing their own vigils, standing along the reservoir with candles, photographs, and prayers. Flyers were reprinted, tacked to telephone poles and community boards, even though most residents had already seen them 100 times. On anniversaries of the disappearance, local media ran small segments, interviewing parents whose voices shook as they begged anyone with information to come forward. Each broadcast reignited a flicker of attention, but it always died out again when no new evidence emerged. The absence of closure created space for darker emotions. Guilt took root. Parents questioned whether they had missed some warning, some subtle shift in their children's moods. Siblings wondered if they should have called that night, maybe convinced them to take a different route. Friends who had seen them just days before replayed those interactions, asking themselves if there had been something unsaid, some secret they had overlooked. The weight of not knowing pressed down on everyone who loved them, and still, the reservoir loomed. For many, it became both the most likely explanation and the cruelest. Every time the families drove past its calm surface, they imagined the car resting somewhere below, hidden by silt and darkness. Divers had searched, yes, but not everywhere. There were places too deep, too unstable. What if the answers were there, just beyond human reach? That thought was both a torment and a strange form of comfort. At least it offered a possibility, however distant. Over time, the community's attention faded. New tragedies took the headlines. New mysteries claimed people's fascination. But for the families, the disappearance never became background noise. It shaped their lives, turning every knock at the door, every phone call from an unknown number, into a moment of desperate hope. Some parents kept the couple's rooms untouched, beds still made, clothes still folded in drawers. Others avoided those spaces entirely, unable to face the pain of what had been left behind. The case officially shifted into what police called inactive status. It was not closed, but it was no longer active either. Detectives acknowledged that without new information, there was nothing more they could do. The families hated that word, inactive, because their grief was anything but. To them, the mystery lived on in every quiet moment, in every family gathering where two people were missing. Absence itself had become a presence, lingering like a shadow that refused to fade. As the 5th year approached, the disappearance took on the haunting quality of legend. The couple's faces appeared on online forums alongside other unsolved cases, their story recounted by strangers who never knew them, but who speculated endlessly about what had happened. To the families, it was salt in the wound, seeing their loved ones reduced to theories, treated as puzzles instead of people. They wanted the world to remember them as they were, young, alive, in love. But memory was no match for the weight of silence. The truth was simple and cruel. The trail was cold. The case had joined the long list of haunting unsolved mysteries, the kind that families never recover from and communities never truly forget. For investigators, it was one more unanswered question filed away in a drawer. For the families, it was a wound that would not heal, an absence that grew heavier with every year that passed. And yet, in that silence, there remained the faintest flicker of hope, the belief that one day, somehow, something would surface. By the time 5 years had passed, the couple's disappearance had settled into the quiet category of cases spoken about only in hushed tones, the kind that felt destined never to be solved. Then, the drought came. It started gradually, with rain clouds that never appeared, with reservoirs and rivers shrinking inch by inch under a punishing sun. What had once been a full, glimmering lake along the highway began to retreat from its shoreline, exposing mudflats and patches of brittle ground that had not seen daylight in decades. Local authorities declared an environmental emergency, rationing water and warning of record-low levels. For the families, the crisis was just one more burden to carry. They could not have known that the same drought would become the catalyst that finally disturbed the silence. As the waterline fell, fishermen began noticing things long hidden. Tree stumps, preserved from when the valley was first flooded, rose like skeletal fingers out of the muck. Old fence posts, rusted cans, even the remains of a dock reappeared. Hikers and boaters shared photos online, strange relics from a forgotten past emerging as the reservoir shrank. At first it was a curiosity, something locals talked about at diners and gas stations. But then the whispers started, that in one section of the exposed shoreline, near a particularly steep bend in the highway, something larger was surfacing. It began with a fisherman who swore he'd seen a glint of metal pushing through the cracked mud. He told a friend that it looked too smooth, too manufactured to be part of the natural debris. Another claimed he saw a shape, rounded like the roof of a car, just beneath a thin layer of silt. These stories spread quickly, retold in half-believing voices, as though speaking them aloud might be tempting fate. People began walking along the receding banks just to see for themselves, pointing to odd bulges in the ground and guessing what they might be. The families, who had lived with 5 years of unanswered questions, listened carefully to these whispers. They had been through it all before: false sightings, cruel rumors, dead-end tips. But the idea that the reservoir, the very place that had haunted them, might finally give something back was impossible to ignore. Quietly, some of them returned to the overlook, watching as the water pulled farther away, as the mudflats widened. They said little, but the weight of their presence was heavy, as though they were bracing themselves for something they had long both feared and needed. Soon, photographs began circulating. A hiker posted an image online showing a metallic curve breaking the surface of the mud. It was partly buried, streaked with rust, but undeniably out of place. The caption was simple: "What is this?" The post spread quickly, drawing attention from locals, then regional news. Reporters began revisiting the story of the missing couple, tying the mystery to the drought, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the water was preparing to reveal what it had hidden. Authorities moved cautiously. They cordoned off the area, citing safety concerns, but everyone knew it was more than that. Investigators wanted to confirm what they were dealing with before word spread further. Environmental crews slogged through the mud, sinking nearly to their knees as they approached the object. From a distance, it was hard to make out, but as they drew closer, the shape became clearer. Curved metal, smooth lines, a structure too large to be a barrel or a dock post. Some of them said later that the silence in that moment was suffocating, broken only by the sucking sound of boots pulling free from wet ground. For those who had followed the case, the implications were unavoidable. If it was what it appeared to be, then the reservoir had not swallowed its secret forever. Instead, it had kept it buried until drought forced it to the surface. The families were notified, though officials were careful with their words. Nothing had been confirmed yet. Nothing could be certain until the object was uncovered. But the news was enough to reignite the old wound, bringing back a flood of grief and dread that had never really gone away. The shoreline became a place of quiet gathering. Locals came to stand at the caution tape, staring out at the cracked earth, whispering to each other about what lay beneath. Some spoke of the missing couple with reverence, saying it must be their car. Others cautioned against jumping to conclusions, reminding everyone that many vehicles had been lost to the reservoir over the years. But the timing, the location, the way the whispers aligned with the old theories, it was impossible to ignore the connection. What unsettled people most was how ordinary the object looked from afar. Just a lump in the mud, just a shadow of metal half buried in silt. Yet to those who had waited 5 years for an answer, it was charged with unbearable significance. If the reservoir was indeed revealing the couple's car, then all the questions, all the theories, and all the grief that had festered in silence were about to be forced back into the open. By the end of that summer, the whispers had grown into a roar. The drought had stripped the reservoir bare, and the families who had lived with endless absence now stood on the edge of something they could not yet name. The silence that had consumed the case was beginning to crack, and from beneath the mud, the reservoir seemed ready to speak at last. The photo that changed everything wasn't dramatic at first glance. It showed a patch of cracked lake bed, its surface split by jagged lines of drought, with something dark and metallic protruding awkwardly from the mud. The hiker who took it had posted it online with a simple caption, "Looks like a car out here." Within hours, the image spread across social media, carried by curiosity and then by recognition. To most, it was just a relic emerging from the shrinking reservoir. But for those who had followed the case of the missing couple, it was more than that. The location, the timing, the shape, it fit too closely with the story that had haunted the region for 5 years. The whispers that had circulated all summer suddenly sharpened into something undeniable. Authorities responded quickly. By the following morning, the area was sealed off with police tape. Patrol cars blocked the nearby road shoulder, and officers waved off curious onlookers who had already begun gathering with cameras. Forensic teams in protective gear made their way down the muddy slope, sinking nearly to their shins with each step. Their movements were slow, deliberate, every action weighed against the possibility of destroying fragile evidence. From the highway above, onlookers watched in silence, the usual chatter of gawkers replaced by an uneasy stillness. It felt as though the entire region had been waiting for this moment, and no one wanted to break its gravity. As the teams worked, the outline of the vehicle grew clearer. Layers of mud were carefully brushed and shoveled away, revealing the roofline and the curve of a windshield caked in silt. Rust streaked across the frame, but beneath it, the metal still held shape. The realization spread through the crowd like a wave. It really was a car. And if it was the one investigators suspected, the drought had not just exposed an old wreck, it had given up the missing couple. Detectives, some of whom had worked the original investigation, stood near the waterline, their expressions grim. They knew what was coming, but protocol demanded patience. Forensics moved slowly, cataloging every detail. Bits of debris were bagged, soil samples collected, photographs taken at every angle. What looked like an ordinary mud-crusted wreck was treated as a crime scene. Until they knew otherwise, it had to be. The breakthrough came when a technician, crouched near the back of the vehicle, scrubbed carefully at a rectangle of metal half buried in muck. Letters and numbers began to emerge through the rust, faint but legible. When the sequence was called out, officers confirmed it immediately. The license plate matched the one listed in the 5-year-old missing persons report. The car belonged to the couple. News of the confirmation spread instantly. Families were notified before the official statement was released, but word still trickled into the community within hours. Reporters returned to the highway overlook, broadcasting live as the scene below played out. The families, after years of silence, collapsed under the weight of sudden truth. Some cried openly, their grief raw and unfiltered. Others simply sat in stunned silence, too overwhelmed to speak. The limbo that had defined their lives for half a decade was ending, but not in the way they had hoped. Closure had come at last, but it came hand in hand with heartbreak. The excavation continued through the evening. Heavy equipment was brought in, but even then the process was slow, designed to preserve rather than damage. The reservoir's mud was dense, gripping the car like a vice. Crews worked carefully to free it inch by inch, documenting every step. Onlookers stayed long after dark, their silhouettes lined against the glow of emergency lights. It was not spectacle they sought, but some form of participation, a need to be present as the case that had defined their community reached its turning point. Detectives later described the scene as surreal. For years, the couple's absence had been a void. No evidence, no trace, just silence. Now, suddenly, here it was, tangible and undeniable, rising out of the same water that had mocked every previous search. It was both vindication and tragedy, the proof investigators had long suspected, but could never touch. The families had always believed the reservoir held the answer. Now they were forced to face the reality of what that meant. As the car's shape emerged fully from the mud, questions began swirling again. Had this been an accident, or was there something more sinister behind it? Would the remains inside confirm one story or suggest another? Detectives said nothing publicly, deferring to the slow grind of forensic work. But the community, watching from the edges, felt the shift. What had once been rumor was now evidence. What had once been speculation was now a discovery. For the parents and siblings who had lived in limbo, the moment was devastating. 5 years of hope and denial collapsed in an instant. The chance that the couple had run away, that they were alive somewhere in hiding, evaporated. The reservoir had kept them all along, and the drought had simply forced the truth into the open. It was an answer, but one that left nothing to cling to. As the vehicle was finally secured and prepared for removal, the crowd above dispersed slowly, some in tears, others in silence. No one cheered, no one celebrated. The discovery was too heavy, too painful. Everyone understood that the next chapter would be even harder, opening the car, looking inside, and finally confronting what the reservoir had held in silence for 5 long years. When the vehicle was finally pulled free from the mud, it was towed carefully to a secure facility where investigators could begin the delicate process of opening it. Years submerged in water and silt had transformed the car into a corroded shell, its metal eaten by rust, its windows opaque with grime. Forensic teams treated it not just as a vehicle but as a sealed capsule of time, knowing that every item inside might hold answers. Families waited outside the facility, holding on to each other, bracing for news they had both dreaded and demanded for half a decade. The first thing investigators found was silence. When the doors were pried open, the interior smelled of rot and rust, the stale imprint of waterlogged fabric and decay. Flashlights cut across the cabin, illuminating fragments of a life once in motion. On the passenger seat lay a purse, still zipped, its leather warped and stiff from years underwater. Inside, detectives found a wallet, identification cards, and small personal items: lip balm, receipts, a folded shopping list. In the glove box was something that brought several investigators to pause: a stack of wedding invitations, sealed in their envelopes, edges softened by moisture but still legible. The couple had been planning a future, their names printed together across embossed paper, never mailed, never delivered. In the back seat, a pair of sunglasses rested at an odd angle, as though they had slipped from someone's hand during a sudden movement. The detail was almost too ordinary, but in context, it felt chilling. A reminder of how abruptly life can fracture. Scattered across the floorboards were other remnants: a phone charger coiled like a snake, coins glinting faintly in the flashlight beams, a travel mug cracked down the side. Each detail painted a portrait of normalcy, a drive interrupted, frozen in place the night they vanished. But the most devastating discovery lay in the front seats. Skeletal remains, partially clothed, sat where the couple had once been. Time and water had stripped away what once identified them, leaving only the barest evidence of their presence. Forensic experts collected each fragment carefully, bagging and labeling with precision. Despite the decay, the positions of the remains told a story. The driver slumped against the steering wheel, the passenger angled slightly toward the window, as though bracing for impact. DNA testing later confirmed what everyone had already suspected: the remains belonged to the missing couple. The announcement was made quietly, almost reluctantly, as if saying it aloud made the finality too sharp to bear. For the families, the confirmation was a paradox. They had begged for answers, but the reality of those answers was crushing. Closure did not feel like relief. It felt like the reopening of every wound they had carried for years. Still, the discovery brought new questions that refused to be silenced. Was this simply a tragic accident? A wrong turn on a dark curve, a vehicle plunging silently into the reservoir with no one to witness it? Or was there something more? Investigators combed through every inch of the car, searching for clues. The airbags had deployed, but the damage to the frame was not as catastrophic as some expected. Tire marks on the road above, discovered only after the drought revealed them, suggested a sudden swerve. But why? Had they been avoiding something? or someone. Inside the car, no signs of struggle were evident, no fingerprints beyond the expected, yet the context remained unsettling. They had vanished on a well-traveled highway, their car invisible to searches for years despite multiple sweeps. Some detectives privately wondered if the vehicle had settled into one of the reservoir's hidden drop-offs, beyond reach of sonar, until Drought forced it back into the open. Others asked if the car's trajectory off the road had been purely accidental, or if something, or someone, had caused it. The belongings inside complicated the picture further. The untouched wedding invitations, the purse zipped neatly, the sunglasses dropped carelessly in the back, all spoke to a life interrupted, not abandoned. Nothing suggested a plan to disappear, nothing hinted at desperation. If anything, the details underscored how ordinary the drive had been until its violent end. Families struggled with the ambiguity. Some clung to the accident theory, needing to believe it was nothing more sinister than a moment's mistake. Others were haunted by the lack of clarity, convinced there was more to the story, that something darker had forced their children from the road and into the water. Closure was promised, but in truth, the answers delivered only sharpened the edges of doubt. Detectives promised further analysis, examining the vehicle's damage patterns, testing soil samples from the mud, reconstructing the possible angles of descent. But they admitted openly that years underwater had eroded much of what might have been decisive. What was left was a mix of fact and speculation, evidence that pointed in multiple directions without committing to one. The community followed every update closely, but the prevailing feeling was one of unease. The reservoir had given up its secret, but the silence of those 5 years lingered like an accusation. Why had it taken so long? Why had every search failed? And above all, why had 2 young lives, so full of promise, ended in a way that seemed both random and unfathomable? In the end, what the car held was both an answer and a riddle. It confirmed what had long been suspected. The couple had never left the scenic drive. Their journey had ended within sight of the road, buried beneath the same water that had been searched again and again. But it also reignited the most painful question of all. Was it truly an accident, or was the silence hiding something that could never be proven? When the vehicle was finally examined in full, forensics began piecing together the fragments of a story that had remained hidden for half a decade. What the Drought revealed on the lakebed was not only the car, but also the road above it, stripped bare by receding water and time. Investigators returned to the northern curve, where the couple's cell phones had last pinged, and there, faint but unmistakable, they found the marks. 2 long black streaks, partially eroded but still visible, cut across the asphalt and disappeared at the edge of the guardrail. The rails themselves were bent outward at an angle, rusting at the fracture points, their damage long mistaken for wear from the mountain's harsh weather. Now, under forensic light, it was obvious a car had gone through at high speed. The skid marks told their own silent narrative. Forensic analysts mapped them carefully, noting how they began abruptly, curving slightly as if the driver had tried to correct course. The length of the marks suggested braking, but not in time. Momentum had carried the vehicle forward, striking the guardrail with enough force to snap through. From there, the trajectory was clear. The car had launched outward, nose first, into the reservoir. Gravity and darkness had done the rest. Inside the vehicle, evidence matched the scenario. The driver's airbag had deployed, its fabric still faintly clinging to the frame, despite years submerged. The passenger's side showed similar impact signatures. The steering column was bent slightly from the driver's body being thrown forward. Bones recovered in the cabin aligned with those positions. The driver slumped into the wheel. The passenger turned outward, braced against the door. The violence of the impact explained the injuries that had prevented either of them from escaping once the car hit water. Analysts reconstructed the night as best they could. The couple had been traveling northbound along the reservoir just after sunset. The curve where the skid marks were found was notoriously dangerous, blind to oncoming traffic, with only a thin rail separating the road from a sheer drop. There was no rain that night, no reported hazards, but visibility would have been fading. A deer crossing, a momentary distraction, or even a misjudgment of the curve could have been enough to send the car off course. By the time the driver reacted, it was already too late. No evidence suggested foul play. The brake patterns were consistent with panic stopping, not forced collision. There were no secondary paint transfers on the car to suggest contact with another vehicle. The tires, though degraded by years underwater, showed no signs of tampering. Forensics combed the interior for DNA, fingerprints, or anything foreign. What they found belonged only to the couple. It was, in the end, a single devastating accident, ordinary in its mechanics, extraordinary in its cruelty. Investigators admitted that the reservoir had been both the cause of the mystery and the reason it endured so long. The water's depth and murk had swallowed the car whole within seconds, dragging it beyond the reach of every sonar sweep, every dive attempt. The vehicle had likely settled into a steep drop-off, pinned by silt and debris, invisible even when searched directly above. The drought, in exposing the hidden sections of shoreline, had accomplished what 5 years of searching could not. For the families, the forensic reconstruction was both relief and torment. Relief, because it ended the speculation that had haunted them, the rumors of abduction, the whispers of foul play, the cruel theories of voluntary disappearance. Torment, because the truth was so brutally simple. A blind curve, a split second of miscalculation, and 2 young lives were gone. No conspiracy, no predator lurking in the dark, just an accident, unseen and unforgiving. Detectives who had carried the case for years spoke of the frustration they felt. The answer had been there all along, lying just beneath the surface, obscured by nature's indifference. One investigator described it as a tragedy hidden in plain sight, the kind that gnawed at you because the solution was so close yet unreachable. Another admitted that the case had haunted him nightly, every time he drove the same stretch of highway and stared out at the reservoir. Now, with the drought's revelation, the mystery was resolved, but not in a way that anyone could find comfort in. The forensic evidence closed the file officially. Reports concluded that the cause of death was accidental, the result of the blunt force trauma and drowning following the crash. There was no criminal investigation to pursue, no one to hold accountable. The story ended where it had begun, with a couple in love on a scenic drive, caught in a single moment of misfortune. Yet, even with the truth established, the silence remained. The families stood at the curve, looking down at the twisted rails and the waterline below, imagining the final seconds of their children's lives. They pictured the headlights cutting across the bend, the sudden skid, the shattering metal, the plunge into darkness. It was unbearable, but it was real. After 5 years of absence, they finally had the one thing that had eluded them: certainty. For the community, the forensic revelations settled the whispers but left a lingering chill. The reservoir had been proven right. It had consumed the couple, held them in silence, and only yielded them when forced by nature's extremes. Drivers slowed even more cautiously at the blind curve, some stopping altogether to glance at the repaired guardrail, a quiet acknowledgement of the lives lost there. The story became a cautionary tale, one etched not only into police reports but into the collective memory of the region. The accident was no longer a theory. It was fact. The forensics had spoken, aligning every mark, every fracture, every detail into a narrative that could not be denied. And in that undeniable truth lay the cruelest irony, that such a vast and haunting mystery had been born from something so small as a single swerve on a darkened road. The announcement came quietly, delivered in a press conference that lasted less than 15 minutes. Detectives who had once stood before cameras with pleas for public assistance now faced the same microphones with the final conclusion. The case was solved. 5 years of speculation, of theories that had stretched from abduction to conspiracy, ended with the simplest and cruelest of explanations. It had been an accident, a single swerve on a blind curve, a guardrail broken, a car swallowed whole by the reservoir. There was no evidence of foul play, no proof of hidden malice. Just misfortune, buried under water until nature itself pulled back the curtain. For the families, the words landed with the weight of inevitability. They had always feared this outcome, and yet part of them had resisted believing it until now. Closure was the term officials used, but it did not feel like closure. It felt like finality, hard, immovable, leaving no room for hope. The press cameras recorded their tears, the way parents leaned into each other for support, the quiet despair that filled the room. Outside, the community that had once searched shoulder to shoulder along the reservoir now gathered in silence, processing the truth. The drought, devastating in every other respect, had become the unlikely deliverer of answers. Reservoir levels had dropped to lows not seen in decades, exposing tree stumps, rusted machinery, and finally, the car that held the couple's remains. For years, the water had been impenetrable, frustrating divers and sonar sweeps, hiding its secret in darkness. Only when the drought forced the shoreline back did the truth emerge. What had once been a place of recreation and beauty was now a graveyard revealed by circumstance. Authorities organized a lakeside vigil in the days that followed, a gesture to honor the couple and provide the families with a space to grieve publicly. Hundreds gathered, carrying candles and flowers. They lined the cracked banks of the reservoir, standing in quiet rows as the sun set. The mudflats stretched out in front of them, broken and dry, the place where the car had been unearthed still marked by caution tape. Parents and siblings placed photographs at the edge of the waterline, images of smiling faces frozen in time, reminders of lives lived briefly and ended abruptly. The vigil was not filled with speeches or ceremony. Instead, it was silence that dominated, an acknowledgement of the 5 years of unanswered questions, of the nights spent waiting for phone calls that never came, of the whispers and theories that had turned loved ones into mysteries. The families stood together, staring at the ground that had hidden the truth. Some wept openly, others simply held candles, their faces blank with exhaustion. It was not peace they felt, but acceptance. For investigators, the case closed with a mix of relief and frustration. Relief because the truth had finally been revealed, because families would no longer be tortured by endless uncertainty. Frustration because the answer had been there all along, hidden just beyond human reach. The drought had succeeded where technology and manpower had failed. Detectives admitted privately that it was a humbling outcome, a reminder that no matter how advanced their tools, nature had the final say. The community, too, wrestled with its emotions. For years, the disappearance had been a source of speculation, a story retold in diners and on message boards, twisted into theories that grew more elaborate with every retelling. Now the mystery was gone, replaced by a simple tragedy. The whispers quieted, but the sense of unease remained. People drove more cautiously along the Scenic highway, pausing at the northern curve where the guardrail had been repaired. Some left flowers tied to the posts, a quiet marker of the lives lost there. Others avoided the route altogether, unwilling to face the place that had claimed 2 young souls. The drought continued long after the car was removed, leaving the reservoir half empty, its secrets exposed. Locals walking the bank spoke of how strange it felt to see the land laid bare, to know that beneath the mud had been the answer to a mystery that had consumed so many lives. The phrase, "the drought's secret," began circulating, used in news stories and casual conversation alike. It was a reminder of how fragile certainty could be, how long silence could last before finally breaking. For the families, grief settled into its final form. There would be no more waiting, no more imagining possible futures. Their children's story had ended not with malice, not with some unseen enemy, but with a moment of misjudgment on a darkened curve. Their love story, once full of promise, had been swallowed by the reservoir and held there for 5 long years. All the dreams folded into wedding invitations, all the plans left unfinished, had been frozen inside that rusted car until the drought forced them back into the light. At the vigil's close, candles were set adrift on the water, flickering across the diminished reservoir. Families and strangers alike stood together, watching the lights float into the darkness. It was a gesture of mourning, but also of recognition, that the silence had ended, that the truth was no longer hidden. What the drought revealed was not just a car pulled from the mud, but the heartbreaking certainty of 2 lives cut short, a future lost to one tragic mistake. The case that had once seemed unsolvable was solved at last, not by skill, not by discovery, but by the cruel timing of nature itself. And as the community turned away from the water that night, one fact remained inescapable. The reservoir had swallowed their love story, and the drought had finally forced it to let go.